Thanks so much for joining us today. My name's Julia. I'm here with Inspira Advantage. We're a college admissions company dedicated to helping medical school applicants get into their dream medical schools by guiding them through the application process. Really excited to be bringing this webinar here for you guys today, all about medical school interviews, insider secrets, and things you need to know about excelling at your interview. We've got some really great panelists joining us today. I'll introduce them in a second. But first, I want to go ahead and get to the agenda and talk about what we'll be talking about today. So first off, we'll do the introduction. So of course, we'll be introducing our two panelists. Then we'll be talking about the interview types. So, in-person interview, virtual interview. And then following that, we'll talk about methods and types. So kind of in line with the last topic that we talked about. Then we'll be talking about navigating common questions that you may asked on your interview, as well as do's and don'ts to set you up for success. And then we'll be talking, or we'll have a time for a Q&A portion. I want to flag that this webinar will be sent out afterwards, so it will be pre-recorded. So if you missed something, or if you want to go back to something, or if an important question was asked and you missed it, you will have that recording sent out, I believe, tomorrow. So, and if you have a question, I would ask that you save it until the Q&A portion. And then put it in the chat box, and then we'll go ahead and answer at that designated time. Alrighty, so now I'll turn it over to our panelists, Chiamaka and Silas. Chiamaka, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Chiamaka. I go by Amaka. I am a fourth-year medical student at Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth. I am applying into dermatology. I'm actually going to be submitting my application this September. And I've been a part of the admissions committee at Dartmouth for 3 years now. And I've been a part of the Inspira family for 2 years. But I have extensive experience helping students like all of you get into their dream medical school.
So my name is Silas. I'm a third-year medical student at the Warren Apple Medical School of Brown. Lifelong Rhode Islander, so I spend a lot of time here at Brown in Rhode Island. Planning on applying to OBGYN. I don't apply until next year, so I have some time left. This is my first one of these webinars with Inspira. I'm really excited to be here. I previously worked with a lot of pre-meds and post-grads applying into med school, planning out their applications, working on essays and interviewing tactics before, so I'm really excited to be doing it here.
Alrighty, sounds good. Thanks so much, guys. Let's go ahead and jump into medical school interview types. Chiamaka, you want to go ahead and get started on that?
Yes. So this is the type of interview we do here at Dartmouth. So you have what's called the traditional or the panel type of interview. I would even list that into 2 different categories. So traditional interviews is what you're probably used to if you're a non-traditional student who've interviewed for a job. A traditional interview is when you come into a room. Most interviews now are virtual. You come into a Zoom room and it's one person interviewing you. A panel interview is when you have 2 or more people interviewing you. So there are so many different ways. You're going to always hear things like closed or open file. I would say that a lot of students they always are like, oh, does the school do closed file or does the school do open file? It's usually very interviewer based. So sometimes I do a closed file interview when I'm interviewing candidates, and sometimes I do open file interviews. And the difference is a closed file would mean that I haven't read anything you've sent to Geisel. An open file means I've read every single thing you've sent to Geisel. And the difference might just be if you have a surgeon or if you have a physician or if you have a busy med student who just could not read your file before the interview, then they'll go closed file. But usually I think most schools encourage open file interview styles. You can always tell if an interviewer is doing a closed file or an open file interview by the questions they ask you. If you're asking you more generic questions, it's more likely that this is closed file and they don't know that much about you. And if you're asking you open questions, like very specific questions about yourself and what you put down in your application, it's more likely that this is an open file interview. There are some interviewers that actually prefer closed file interviews where they standardize your questions and they ask every single person the same question. That is a way to reduce bias. Some people, even if they have open file and they've read your application, they might still ask every single person they interview a very standardized question. So again, you might be interviewed by people from the admissions committee that are not physicians or medical students. You might be interviewing from faculty who are attendants who are physicians, or you might be interviewed by people like me who are medical students. So just whenever you get an interview, it's always prudent to know what type of interview style you're getting.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And we'll go ahead and get started on virtual interviews.
Okay, great. So virtual interviews are probably what most of you will be doing. Most residencies have gone virtual as well. Med schools are all pretty much virtual right now. I don't see that changing for most fields in the near future. So this is a really good topic to be familiar with, and I'm sure you already are. A live interview is kind of more like what we were just talking about with the panel interviews or the kind of traditional interviews. The way we do it here at Brown is you'll usually have multiple live interviews at different times of the day. So you'll have 2 or 3 interviews, usually with at least one faculty, sometimes a second faculty member, sometimes a senior medical student. And they're very similar to the traditional interview. It's a one-on-one. Rarely they can be panels. I mean, panels kind of introduces a whole new level of technical difficulties into these. So I've seen schools most likely try to keep them one-on-one. They're question-based, so you follow the same rules we were just talking about, open versus closed file. Usually they use Zoom or Google Meet. Something I've seen students run into is problems with Zoom, and sometimes physicians use Doximity. Doximity is like this software that most physicians use to make anonymous calls to patients. I don't think you need to know too much about Doximity, but be at least familiar with it, because I have seen students have technical difficulties with their Zoom interviews and then get a Doximity call from the physician interviewing them. Which is a really stressful added thing you might not be expecting. So I don't want anyone to be surprised if that happens. It's probably not going to. The pre-recorded interview is something that I think most people find more difficult. I certainly would. This is a system. AAMC has their own tool for doing them. It's only used by about 50 schools right now, I think. At least it was in the last cycle. And they have these pre-determined questions and usually have a minute to read the question and then anywhere between 2 and 3 minutes to respond to the question on video. You don't have to do all the questions at once. I think there's about 6 questions usually on the AMC tool. You can break them up. You can do a few, take a break, come back and do the others. And those responses are shared with the committee. This is obviously a really unnatural way of interviewing, so I would practice it. It's a lot more easy to have a conversation with a person than it is to talk blankly into a camera. So it's a skill that I would suggest you practice before you actually go and do one of these.
I can add a little bit on the virtual interviews. I have found that when I think of like the last 2 cycles for Dartmouth have been virtual, and the only time I felt like a virtual interview wasn't going well was when their internet just wasn't up to par. So their video was cutting out, their audio was cutting out. Again, usually have 30 minutes per interviewer, sometimes less, sometimes a little more. So you really want to make sure your connection is very strong. So please always check with a friend that your connection is strong the night before or the day off. And if it's not, use an Ethernet instead of just connecting wirelessly. Also, there's so many questions about what should be in the background, how clean should it be. I would say the only rule is I would rather a student, or I've heard that people would rather not have you have a Zoom background. So people have blurred backgrounds or like a picture in the background. It's always better to just remove all backgrounds and show wherever you are. And again, I think anyone who feels that a student needs to have a clean background is coming from a place of inequity, because there are some people that are from wealthier families who have gorgeous homes, and there's some people who share rooms with other people. And I think it's fair that different backgrounds show different things. And I know there's that invasion of privacy where we're seeing into your living environment. So maybe go to a library or a place you're comfortable with instead of doing a blurred background. And instead of focusing on what should I have behind me during a virtual interview, I would say the best thing to focus on is how you're connecting to your interviewer. Because again, my rule of thumb with an interview is that you should think of your interviewer as basically the person who is your advocate. They're advocating for you during the admissions committee. They'll be like, for example, Silas, what do we know about Silas? Every other person who is voting on your application has not met you except the 1, 2, 3 people who interviewed you. So they're the ones advocating for you. So instead of worrying about every other thing going on around you and all this minutia, how did you connect to your interviewer? Are you looking into their eyes? So maybe speaking to friends and telling, like asking your friends, like, if I look this way, do I look like I'm looking away? Do I, if you're taking down notes, does it look like I'm taking down notes? Does it look like I'm distracted? So make sure you tease those things out instead of worrying about the other minutia.
Also, if you have roommates, this is a really important thing to communicate to them that's happening. I personally have roommates, and I've always had to make sure they know about things like this happening in the house, just because a lot of us have to take these interviews from our home. It's where we're familiar. It's where we might have like some semblance of control in our environment. So if you have roommates, it's important to communicate like which times you'll be interviewing, what you might need from them. Most people are pretty accommodating.
Thanks so much, guys. That's such a great point about the background. I would have thought it would have been better to use like a blurred background, but learn something new every day, right? Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get started and talk about interview prep methods and tips. We've already talked about, we already touched on it with the background and everything like that, but let's dive deeper into that.
Yes, so there's the first point, show your personality. So again, if you got to the point of an interview, your grades and accomplishments were enough. Pre-meds hear this, but they just will not believe us. But I promise you, it's very true. I have recommended we don't accept someone with a 525, while I've recommended an acceptance for 507. So again, it's all about how they connected with me and what I feel like they're going to add to the institution and to medicine. So show your personality, and that is very true. Your grades at that point do not matter. I think a lot of schools are also moving to the point where if you got to the interview stage, it means that you pass through your screening for your grades. After that, for example, at Dartmouth, when I'm presenting a candidate, I am not allowed to talk about your grades anymore. I'm only allowed to talk about who I think they are. So mock interviewing is the best prep method. It's very true. I still have videos from back in the day when I was applying to med school where I was prepping and I would take videos of myself, my friends and my family. They would ask me questions and I would respond to them, and I would take videos of myself and I'll go back and I'll watch them and I'll say, did I talk too much? Did I not? Again, you want to make sure you're not sounding too rehearsed, but you want the fine balance of, okay, this person took this interview seriously and they prepped, but you're not too rehearsed. It's a fine balance, and practice makes perfect. Again, practice makes perfect. Learn and mind your body language. I am someone, I use my hands a lot. So during my interview prep, I have to learn to put my hands down and make sure I'm not really doing the gestures that are more innate to me. So minimize fidgeting, keep your body language open. I really, really enjoy when a candidate is talking to me and they're really leaning in, compared to when they're leaning out, you're looking around, you're writing things. So really practice and see what your body language is saying. Sometimes you might feel like your body language is open. That's why asking friends and family to watch you is always important, because they know you best. They probably already know where your quirks in quotes are, and they're able to point them out for you.
Yeah, I can't stress the first point too much. That's the most important thing to remember, is that when we interview you, we really want to figure out if we want to work with you for 4 years. We're kind of inviting you into our community by accepting you to a school. So your grades and accomplishments, that's kind of past. That gets you the interview. So really trying to connect the interviewer is the most important thing. And also talking slowly. This is something that I've personally always struggled with whenever I'm in something important, like an interview or a call. I always rush through what I'm saying. So talking slowly is also something if you struggle with. This is a time to practice. Take a video of yourself, talk with a friend, talk with one of us. This is how we get you better at these skills that are pretty minimal maybe in your mind, but to person interviewing you are very important.
For sure, for sure. We know that personality is super important in an interview. I want to ask, are there any specific traits per se that you look for that make an applicant more appealing in the interview process?
I won't say there's a particular trait on my behalf because, again, if you, for example, were a class of 93, I do not want to fill my class with a certain trait. I don't want 93 people who are the same. That would make for a class that is basically not favorable to the medical community. Because, again, for medicine to keep evolving, we need people to bring different things. That's why showing your personality is so important. Because again, it's a two-way street. You want a school who feels like, oh my God, you have something to add to my school, because that's where you're going to excel. So if you show your personality and they don't like it, you are better off.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I much rather hear you talk about something you're passionate about and really excited about than hear you talk about something that you might be less excited about that you think I would be interested in. So if you're really, really passionate about something that I'm not particularly well versed in and you can talk about it from a point of like this really innate love for it, then I love to see that.
Great point. So true. Alrighty, now we're going to talk about the SHARE method.
Yeah, so the SHARE method is a framework that we can give you guys. It's not something you have to follow. I'm sure there's other methods out there of answering interview questions, but this is a good place to start because your interview questions shouldn't really be too freeform. They should have some structure. They should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, kind of like you're writing a paper. So SHARE is this acronym situation. So we ask you a question, sum it up real quickly. What's the situation you're in? Hindrances, identified challenges, or hindrances you faced. So this is where you draw on your personal experience. Actions, the actions you actually took in those situations and why you took them. The results of those actions, whether or not you expected them, whether or not they were a surprise, whether or not they're exactly what you wanted, and evaluate the lessons you learned. This could be the last part, I think, is the most important part because it shows some level of self-reflection. You want to say, were the actions I took good? Were they bad? Were they intended? Would you do something differently if you had the opportunity again? This kind of shows us how you approach problems, which is really what we want to know because how you approach problems is a big part about being in med school and being a doctor.
And this is, so again, I'm applying to residency. Basically, I'm in the throes of it. And I've been going through interview prep. And with SHARE, make sure like if you're trying to put a number in your head, your situation and your hindrances should be about 30%, while majority of it should be your actions, results, and evaluate, because that is really where your that's really where most of in is. Okay, who are you as a candidate? That's where we're getting most of that from the actions and results and the evaluate part.
For sure. Alrighty, so we've reached the point where we're going to talk about navigating common interview questions. The most important part, I feel.
So tell me about yourself is a classic question. It's one of those things where most people feel like they need to basically talk about every single thing in their application. So whenever you're answering a question, I always tell myself, like, what's the one thing I'm trying to communicate when I ask this question? And in the tell me about yourself portion, it's whatever you feel like, okay, this is the one very important part of myself I'm trying to communicate. That is when you just summarize who you are as a person, what led you to medicine, and then what's the most important. So when you go into an interview, keep in mind 3 things you want to make sure your interviewer takes away from that interview. The first most important thing, put that in the tell me about yourself portion. Why do you want to attend this school? I think that is a very interesting one because I feel like I personally don't. I know some people weigh it more than others. I personally don't weigh it because there's so many reasons people might want to attend one school over the other. But make sure you're being very truthful when you're answering this question because again, the person who is asking this question is in the institution. So they know that institution. So if you're making stuff up, they would be able to see through that. So if you have a very particular reason, answer that. If you don't, feel free to say that. Like, I really think that your school is great at this and that, but I would love to ask you more about your institution. Why do you want to be a doctor? Or why not a nurse or a PA? That is, I don't think that's a question I would ask people usually, but that is a question that is very personal to everyone. So if you have a personal anecdote of why medicine, when you talk about your personal statement, I feel like that is something that you had to brainstorm. So that should be very easy for you to answer. Where do you see yourself in X years? I remember I had that question during my med school interview, and I don't think I answered that question very correctly because I was thinking that they wanted me to know exactly where I saw myself in X years. And most people in med school, most people in medicine, they know that your interests are going to change based on life, based on situations, based on mentorships, based on opportunity. So they're just asking in general where you see yourself. Do you see yourself being an advocate for the underprivileged? Do you see yourself being a physician scientist? Do you see yourself being very do you see yourself being someone who is very into academia, into education? Do you have a sense of what you enjoy? Instead of saying like, oh my God, I really want to be this cardiothoracic orthopedic dermatologist. That is, I would say that's a question that would be an answer where I would be like, because I want you to come into med school with an open mind. I want you to be able to get everything from medicine and then figure out your journey from there. So just tell me in broad strokes, where do you see yourself in X years? What's your greatest strength and weakness? So this question, if you use the share method, you'll be able to answer this. Most people are really good at answering their strength, but your weakness should not be a hard thing to answer because again, just quickly talk about why you think there's a weakness, what situation you felt like you were weak at. And then once you say the rest of it should just go into how you've addressed those weaknesses. This can actually be one of the most powerful questions because it would show that you know yourself and you're someone who can pivot when you have a weakness. Describe a challenge, ethical dilemma, or a time you did something that wasn't popular, but you felt was right, how you overcame that situation. Again, this is where share comes in. What three adjectives best describe you? This is actually the perfect one where you should ask right now as you're brainstorming, even before your interview, ask your friends and your family, describe me. What three adjectives would you describe me? See what every single person says and then consolidate that. Your friends and your family are a lot better at helping you answer interview questions than you would even imagine. And then what makes you unique? What makes you unique should be this is basically what are your strengths? What do you think you're going to bring to any institution that takes you? What do you think you're going to bring to medicine? It could be that you're first generation. It could be that you've had a lot of obstacles along the way. It could be that you've had this amazing knowledge in this very specific thing. There's so many ways you can answer that question.
Yeah, and a big thing in general is that all of these demonstrate that you've done a lot of self-reflection, right? So that's a big part of the reason why people ask these questions in interviews is because we know that you should be preparing for these questions because these are pretty common questions to get. So we want to see that you've taken the time to research and think like, why do you want to attend this certain school? And you've thought about where you see yourself in next years and your strengths and your weaknesses. This is all about self-reflection, which is a huge part of medical school.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. Alrighty. One other thing that's super important, to have questions for your interviewers. So let's dive into this. What questions are we asking them?
Yeah, so this is super important. I would say this is just as important as anything else. Because remember, if you're going to commit to a school for 4 years, you want to be in an environment where you're going to thrive. Just as you're trying to kind of sell yourself to a school in their image of what they want, the same is true vice versa. The schools want to be these schools that people want to go to. This will be shaped in some part by where you do see yourself in a few years. So if you see yourself doing primary care in an underserved area, you want to see what opportunities that school has for you to develop relationships with physicians who are doing that currently. If you know that you want to be, in a certain fellowship and you want to see what type of fellowship trained doctors that institution has. Also, if you're someone who's planning on going into a specialty that is known as being a more research-heavy specialty, you want to know what research opportunities are available for students. That's a really big common pitfall I've seen people run into before, where they apply to med school with this ideal specialty. They know they're really passionate about it. They might have worked in it before med school, and they get there and they find that research opportunities are very slim. This happens a lot of times in bigger cities where there's lots of medical schools and there's a lot of cross-training at specific hospitals. You might find that students from certain schools will kind of suck up all the research opportunities, while students from other schools might have to fight a little harder to find opportunities. And you want to know if that's going on at the school you're applying to, because that's going to really shape how well you can build your resume over the next 4 years. What stress management resources do you offer to students? So this is something that med schools, I think, are working a lot on currently and have been in recent years. It's stress management and wellness. You want to know, is there certain academic staff whose job is wellness? I know at Brown we have Dean of Wellness, whose job is just to make sure students have opportunities to promote wellness. What sort of requirements are you expected to be in person for your first 2 years in preclinical years? Some preclinical years are mostly remote, some are very in-person heavy, and that can have a huge impact on your wellness if you find that you study better at home or in person. Those are things to know as well. How do students perform on the MBME exams? Step 1, Step 2, also the exams in third year, mostly with the clerkship exams, because those are also computed with a national average. Knowing where students at your school sits is a really good proxy for how teaching at your school is going. So if you ask this to your interviewer and you're seeing that students are consistently taking multiple tries to pass Step 1, or there's a low score on Step 2, or you're seeing that the shelf exams, which are the exams you take during your third year clerkships, are lower averages nationally in the specialties you're interested in. Those are important things to know about, because those are a good metric for how well you're being educated on those topics. How are students evaluated for the coursework? So is preclinical graded? Is it pass-fail? Are there rankings? So are the rankings public? Are the rankings internal? Are there no rankings at all? You'd be surprised how many schools out there are pass-fail with no rankings, but they exist on a spectrum. Some schools are graded with public rankings. So that's a really important thing to know before going into medical school, because that has a really big impact on mental health. Can you tell me more about diversity and culture in your med school? You want to know if you're going to mesh well with the culture at your med school. Med schools are like companies. They all have different cultures and different levels of diversity. And you want to know, is this a culture I'm really comfortable going into and kind of contributing to? Because as a student there, you will be contributing to the culture. What do people know about your med school that you wish? What don't people know about your med school that you wish they did? This one's kind of subjective. I've never really heard this one before. If I was an interviewer and someone asked me this, I'd actually have a pretty hard time answering it. I think this is a good opportunity for them to tell you something positive about the school. I think most interviewers are more likely to tell you something good about the school in this situation than something bad. But it's a good question to ask. And what does your medical school do to improve and serve the community? This is a really important topic. Some med schools are the only medical school in the area. Others are one of many. And as a medical student, you're really involved with the community. You're working in hospitals that serve the community. You're working in clinics that serve the community. Oftentimes there are free clinics you can work in that serve the community. And it's not too helpful to the community if you're just a rotating person and you're kind of there and you leave and there's no continuity. You want to know, what can you do as a medical student to help improve the continuity that the patients in that community are getting? Even if it's not something you're particularly interested in, any specialty you're interested in has some level of community service in it. So this is a really important opportunity to realize before you commit to a medical school for 4 years.
So I would just like to add what I feel like a lot of pre-meds ask and they shouldn't be asking. A lot of people think this is the time for me to really research about my interviewer and go into your PubMed and go on YouTube and go on their social media and ask about the specific things. If there are things that you've worked on, if there are interests that you share, very fair game. But if you're just asking them to ask them, they'll see through that because one, most times all 4 or 5, depending on how long you end up being in med school, you might never actually run into your interviewer. Because they might be busy, they might be in the hospital. You might run into them once if you're not interested in their specialty. So they're not the reason you're coming to that school or you're getting accepted into that school. They're just a vessel. So you don't want to use your precious interview time to try to warm up to them in a way that is not genuine. So if you're asking about your very specific interest, make sure it's something that aligns with you. If not, stick with questions that involves the medical school.
So true. Really great point there. Alrighty, so now we're gonna land on med school interview do's and don'ts, also super important. Alrighty, what do we do during a med school interview?
So what to do, wear appropriate professional attire. I know a lot of interviews are virtual, but you do want to still be in. I would wear a suit, but you don't have to wear a suit. Make sure you look professional. A lot of people might not wear pants because they're just head up, but you just never know what might happen during your interview. Something might happen, and your kid comes in or your pet comes in or something spills on you and you have to stand up. So it's always better to be more prepared and to wear that professional attire. Again, I know people might be like, oh, it's endearing to have my cat come in or my dog come in or my kid come in. It's not. Please make sure you're not getting distracted during your interview and keep all distractions away. As much as I would love to see your cat or your dog, you would not have that if this was a traditional interview. You should keep it the same way. You should always be on time, even if the interviewer is late, because sometimes the interview for the other candidate might run a little bit late, but most interviewers would then push your interview a little further, but you always want to be on time. Be cautious, courteous to every single person you interact with, every single person, because that person you run into, again, this is a virtual interview, but most times you might even have some schools would have interactions with students before the actual interview day. Every single person is looking out for you. They are not going to put any input into if you should be accepted, but they can absolutely put an input if you should not be accepted. If someone files a complaint against you, we're going to take that very seriously. Use concrete lived examples. You do not want to make up your examples. You do not want to lie because you never know what that other person who is interviewing you knows about that situation. Balance speaking time, especially when you're in a group. Make sure you're not hugging the time because, again, when you're doing an MMNI or a group interview, we're looking at how you interact with other interviewees. Speak professionally, yet be conversational. I would tell people to lean on speaking more than speaking less, because there's always a fear that, oh my God, am I hugging the time? Am I talking too much? I would rather you talk too much than you talk less, where I'm having to fill in the blank for you. Keep your body language open, relax, lean into that interview, and have questions for your interviewer. Send a thank you note. It's not a requirement. It really isn't. But if you do, I would say send it the day off, because usually I and a lot of interviewers, they're already sending their input the night of after the interview or the next day. So if you're sending a thank you note a week after, we already put in our recommendation by the time we get that note.
Yeah, I just want to echo what you said about the group setting. We really care about how you interact with people you're interviewing with in a group. It shows how you're going to interact with people you work with. And that's really what we care about when we're interviewing. We want to see if we're going to work well with you. And being respectful to everyone you interact with from any level of the interviewing process is crucial. Most med schools see everyone who's involved in the process as a big family, and if you're disrespectful to any part of that family, that no one's going to take it lightly.
And when we talk about interactions, this means emails. From the first day you email us, and surprisingly, we actually have a hub where we have all the interviews candidates send us, all the emails candidates send us. So make sure you're being very respectful in those emails.
Really great points there. Okay, so we've gotten over what to do. Now, what not to do, also equally as important.
Okay, yeah, equally as important for sure. So go for the shock factor. This could range from anything to being, talking about something that's really out of the box of medicine, or trying to do something that's just really like not typical of an interview. Again, even though these interviews will most likely be virtual, we're trying to represent an in-person interview as much as possible. So shock factor, usually not a great bet. Keep it simple, be conversational. We don't want to see anything crazy. Simply listing your awards and achievements, again, we talked about earlier, isn't that useful because we already have those, or the med school at least already has them, even if your interviewer themselves doesn't. Those awards and achievements are really important, and they've helped you get to this part of the process. But from here on out, we're more interested in who you are as a person, less interested in who you are on paper. Sounding overly rehearsed is a big stumbling block for a lot of students. A lot of students know somewhat what the questions they're going to be asked are, either by resources online or they've talked to students who have applied in the past. And if you sound overly rehearsed, it doesn't come off that well, because then it shows me that you're kind of trying to hide who you are. Maybe not in a bad way, but if you sound really rehearsed, I'm not getting a good look at who you are as a person. I want to have a conversation with you, not hear you write or talk about your prepared answers. Being negative, really not a good idea. Even if you're not super stoked about every aspect of everything during the interview, be positive, be engaged. We can pick up when someone's being negative. You should have some relevant questions prepared. We talked about that earlier. Definitely have something. That time shouldn't be a complete lull in conversation. Using humor sparingly or not at all. This is a professional setting, so humor can go either way. I think if you have a really good rapport with your interviewer, maybe you can use some humor, but always err on the side of caution. Remember, it's a kind of a formal process. Veering off topic in a completely different direction, also pretty counterintuitive to the formal process of interviewing a medical student. We want to hear about your applications in medical school, what's going to make you a good doctor, how you handle tough situations. Talking about something that's completely unrelated for an extended period of time probably isn't the best use of our time. Because again, most of the people interviewing you are either busy medical students, practicing physicians. I know some physicians interview medical students in between patients, so they're really rushed. So veering off topic completely will not only hurt your image you're showing of yourself, but also your interviewer might be a little perturbed by it because it kind of seems like a waste of their time.
I would like to give 2 examples of memorable interviewees who were negative, just so you understand what we mean by do not be, like, that can mean very different things. I had an interviewee who was coming in and he said he was interested in ortho, and his mom was an OB, and he was like, I could never do OB. Again, that's fine. But I'm not even interested in OB, and I took that a certain way because, again, it shows that you're closed-minded, and why are you negative towards a specialty? There's camaraderie in medicine. We're all a team, and every single person in medicine has their role and their importance. So I was like, And then another interviewee who was talking about their experience in college, but only spoke about the negative experiences. And I know sometimes there's some programs, there's some people that just are not great, and I understand that. Toxicity in academia is very real, but it showed no introspection because it was like there can be toxicity, but how did you evolve from it? What did you learn? Maybe what you learned was, I don't want to be in a program like this. But instead of hammering on that program, speak on what you learned from it, how you grew from it, what you're going to move forward from that, instead of just like leaning into the negative. So again, there are different ways that can come up, but anything where you're like ruminating on something that doesn't put someone else or something else in a good light, I think it's better you just leave that off.
So true. And it seems obvious to not be negative, but I can imagine sometimes when you're in the thick of a conversation, maybe it comes up. So if there's one thing we can kind of take from this, it's to always be positive, right? Okay, so we've reached the Q&A portion of our webinar. So if you have any questions, leave them in the chat box. We'll go ahead and answer them. I want to touch base on the whole rehearse but don't sound too rehearsed situation when we're dealing with interviews. Where do you draw the line there? What I know we kind of touched on, being too rehearsed sounds too robotic, but how long? I guess what I'm trying to say is, what is the recommended time to practice your interviews, and when does it border on being too rehearsed?
I would think that you should go into the interview knowing the points you want to get across to the specific questions, but you shouldn't have them written out exactly how you want to say them. I think practicing different ways you can get those points across through mock interviewing is a great way to prepare. But if you're going to sit down and write a whole document with a pre-written answer, even if you don't plan on using it, you might find yourself during the interview kind of going back to that like pre-written thing in your head, and it might come off as a little robotic. So I would err on the side of caution of even like writing down full responses to questions. I think it's more natural to say, this is what I want to get across to the interviewer. This is what I want to know about them. And then we practice different ways I can get that across in conversation.
I always tell people, make sure you have 3 things that you're saying in 30 minutes when I drop this call. If it's a Zoom, webcam, virtual interview, what do I want my interviewer to know about me? That is what you're rehearsing into your answers. That's why you're like, okay, how do I phrase that? But at the very least, you want to be able to pivot. If I decide that I don't want to hear anything about anything else except what you do for fun, you should be very comfortable still conveying those 3 things you want me to take away, but still going with what I, the interviewer, want. You should be able to pivot. That's when that non-rehearsal comes in. If you cannot pivot, if you cannot go with the flow, if you cannot lean into the vibe of your interviewer, then you're going to come off as very robotic. But make sure you have things that you're like, if this person is going to give an elevator pitch about me, regardless of how this interview goes, what would they say I am as a candidate? I always tell people too, like if you have scenarios in your head, like, oh, this happened at some time when I was in my lab, and this was a stressful situation, this is something I overcame. So just having those scenarios in your head and finding ways where you can answer and weave those scenarios in, that's a good way. So you've rehearsed, you've thought about how to answer those questions, but you can pick and choose when to bring on that scenario, when to bring on this lesson, when to bring on this answer. So you're picking and choosing based on the vibe and the questions being asked.
So true. I've got a question here. Would reviewing the medical school's values help in the interview?
I think absolutely. I mean, I don't see any way it could harm you. Knowing the medical school's values plays into a lot of what we talked about tonight as far as, what are they focused on? What's their level of community engagement? What do they do for their students in regards to wellness? So knowing those values going in will be very helpful because you can tie them into some of your answers, maybe without being too explicit, but also if you mention a specific value, it does show that you've done your research on that specific school.
So many candidates always ask, like, how do I know what med school values? Yes, if you go on your website, they usually have a mission, they have values, and usually those are pretty generic between schools. Some of them you can tell, like, there's some schools that are very community focused, some schools are very research focused, so you can tell. But I find that an amazing way in this day and age is to go on your social media and see what things they highlight that your students are doing. So if you go to Brown and you see that on your social media, there are multiple highlights for all the amazing things your students are doing in the community, and all the amazing grants your students are getting, and all the amazing trips and scholarships they're getting, then you're like, okay, this school really values this type of candidate. This school really values this type of medical student. Am I this type of medical student? Is this something I was valuing in my medical education? And then you can talk about it.
Another question we have here is, do some medical schools ask questions about their values? So assuming in their interview.
I think asking directly about values is less common in interviews. I know it's very common in secondary essays. That's a whole separate topic. Usually I've seen that if schools do want to ask you about how much research you've done on their values, they'll do it in the essay format. But if it's a school you're very interested in and you want to be really prepared for the interview, I think going over the values is a good idea.
Yeah, like a way they can phrase that question would be, why do you want to come to my school? Why my school specifically? That is basically a way they would phrase it, but to straight up ask about your values, probably not.
So in other words, be familiar with them, but they're not going to test you on it, so you don't have to memorize them word for word. Alrighty, as a follow-up question to that, we have, is there a point at which it seems too much like sucking up when talking about why you want to go to a school, or when discussing their values and how they fit you?
There is no, I personally don't think there's ever a way you can be too much. Again, I feel like sucking up quotes would be if you're sucking up to me as the interviewer. I don't see that very positively because, again, you're not coming here because of me. You probably might not see me again. You might, but I won't be directly involved in your education or in the way you go through your medical school journey. But if you're telling me about something very specific to my school, I would love to hear that, because that really does matter. When I look at different candidates, if there are two candidates that are amazing and I would be like, these are amazing candidates, it won't be the only reason I would choose a candidate, but if there's a very specific reason they would want to come to my school, I would weigh that. Because again, and this is also going to happen when you're applying to residency, we want happy students. We want students who are fulfilled. We want students who want to be here. We don't want students who just chose us because we were the only school that gave them an acceptance and now they just have to be miserable for 4 years. That is not a student I personally want in my institution. So if you're telling me very specific reasons why you would come here, I would take that into account. I would caution, though, you have to make sure you're thinking about, and I'm very, very equity-centered with all my questions. Again, different interviewers have different ways of thinking about this, but I would say you want to also make sure that your answers are not making you seem privileged. Everyone has privilege, right? But if you're telling me that you want to go to this very expensive ski resort and it's very close here, that's not a reason I would want to choose you to come to my school. But if you tell me you have family here, you have things you enjoy, hobbies you enjoy. So again, it's phrasing, how you're phrasing that particular interest. And I always mention that because people just don't know when they're answering. You might answer a question and you're answering that question in a very genuine way and the way that means so much to you, but the way you phrase it might come off a different way. So make sure that whatever your reasons are, you're framing it in a way where it's about you and it's about what you're going to gain and your mental health and wellness and your education and your career, and not particular things that might be, oh, you're looking down on this person or that school or the other school or that. Like, remove anything negative, anything that would be a little more, are they exposed to different? Because again, you're going to be walking around people who are underprivileged, other classmates, other patients, so make sure you're framing any answers around that mindset.
Great point. We do have another question. How do you acknowledge unfortunate circumstances without trying to get sympathy from the interviewers?
Yeah, so that's a difficult line to kind of toe. Unfortunate circumstances happen to everyone, and they shape us as people, and they obviously have a huge impact on why many people become doctors. And I think they can also help shape values, which is really something you do want to talk about in your viewing. I think framing it, if you have a specific circumstance that you think shaped your values or shaped why you want to go to med school, it's a good thing to mention. But maybe just mention it through the lens of something else, about another reason why you're passionate to go to med school. So it's like something unfortunate happened to you that led you to a new situation in your life or a new experience in your life. Talk about how that experience has helped you grow as a person.
Yeah. Just echoing, this is where share really helps you whenever you're talking about anything, because at the end of it, regardless of how you speak on a circumstance, if you're not telling me what you got from that situation, whatever you're sharing becomes less valuable to me as an interviewer, because I want to know how you grew from that, what you learned from that, how that will shape your journey, shape you as a student, shape you as a physician, shape you when you interact with your patients, shape you when you interact with the community. So regardless of when you're talking about an unfortunate situation, and I know I've talked to a lot of students who, it's something, a lot of things are very personal, so it's also how comfortable you are sharing that situation. But I would encourage you to share it if you feel comfortable sharing it. But regardless of how you share it, always end on that. What did I learn from that? How would this shape my journey? If you don't end in that, you've misused that opportunity.
Great points and great questions. Thank you for asking all the questions, and thank you for answering. I think that just about does it for the questions that we have, unless somebody has any last minute questions. But in the meantime, I'll wrap up really quickly. Just want to say thank you so much for joining us. I hope this conversation was insightful. Thank you to our panelists for joining and adding to the really insightful conversation. I know I learned a lot, so I'm sure everybody else learned a lot too. Just to flag again, as I mentioned, this webinar will be recorded and sent out for your review later on. And if you have any questions, feel free to respond to the email that we will send out tomorrow. Other than that, thank you so much for joining us again, and have a great night. Bye, everyone.
Bye.